biodiversity is a term that has come into vogue over the last several years, and it's one of these terms that gets thrown out a great deal, and oftentimes we don't know exactly what it means. But in thinking of the range of flora and fauna, of the different kinds of animals and plants that surround us, that's what we're getting at with biodiversity. And it's something that we're recognizing is increasingly important, not only to our ecosystems, but to human health. And it's something that is important to the world around us because it's under threat. So today we're sitting down with two leading experts who've just hosted a whole symposia around biodiversity, issues, concerns, and new ideas to learn more about what biodiversity means, what it means to us, and why it's changing all around us all the time. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and Associate Director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. So today I'm joined by Dr. Scott Egan, who is an associate professor of biosciences at Rice University, and Dr. Korey Evans, an assistant professor of biosciences also at Rice. And Dr. Evans and Dr. Egan have just hosted an entire symposium on biodiversity, and they're here to join us to tell us a little bit about what it is and why it matters. Dr. Korey Evans, Dr. Scott Egan, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Just to start off, can you tell us a little bit about you and your work, just so our listeners can get a sense of where you are in the world and your interest in biodiversity before we jump right into what that is?
Sure. I'll go first. My name is Scott Egan. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biosciences, and my lab is really interested in the origin and maintenance of biodiversity. So we study many concepts within evolution, but specifically the process of speciation, where we study how one thing turns into many. Most of that work is focused on herbivorous or plant-feeding insects, and so there's an amazing diversity of those insects even right here on Rice's campus.
Yes, it seems like every year we discover a new kind of wasp around here.
Yes.
Yeah, and my name is Korey Evans. I'm an assistant professor in the Biosciences Department at Rice University, and I'm also a fish biologist and evolutionary biologist. And me and my lab, we're really interested also in the evolution of biodiversity, more from a trait perspective. So we look at how traits change over time, and we look at some of the drivers of trait evolution within that context, that broader context of biodiversity.
Great. So we have two folks deeply thinking about biodiversity, also deeply thinking about insects and fish, which just sounds fun. I'm sure we'll get more into that. But just to start us off, what is biodiversity and why does that matter? What does that help us to understand about the world or shape in our own lives? Because I think folks are probably a little unfamiliar with the term and then think, okay, lots of plants and animals, cool. And what more to there is there on biodiversity?
Yeah, so biodiversity is kind of this broad umbrella term that has a bunch of different definitions, but I would define it as kind of the diversity of species within a given place. And it's, necessarily a broad definition, but that refers to insects, birds, plants, mammals, lizards, bacteria, you name it. And biodiversity also encapsulates these complex interactions at kind of multiple scales of biological organization, within these ecosystems.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, so it is in addition to the number of species we share any place with, it's the interactions, how they interact, because they interact differently in different places. And then even within species, it can be things like variation in form or function, or even genetic variation within a species that can also be captured within this term biodiversity.
And so why does that matter to us? What does that do, especially in terms of kind of thinking about humans, because I think we are often thinking of ourselves first. Why is it important to be in places that are biodiverse rich?
So I would argue that biodiversity kind of makes the world go round, right? So even if you start with just a human, just a single individual human, the biodiversity of your microbiome, for instance, of your gut microbiome, can strongly influence other aspects of your health. It can influence what you can and can't eat. It can influence how you feel after eating a meal. And that all has to do with the kind of microbe community in your gut. So if you take those principles and you expand it out, across ecosystems, these very delicate kind of balances between species and how they're interacting really do kind of strongly influence the day-to-day kind of comings and goings of these different ecosystems. And it really does make the world go round. Many of these species have very specific roles where they live and in their ecosystems, and without them, there's no redundancy to, kind of fill that role again.
Can you give us an example of what you're talking about, maybe from your own work with fish? Like how does having those different range of fish species do exactly what you're describing of, play specific roles?
Yeah, so a great example is kind of the herbivorous fish on coral reefs. So herbivorous fishes are fishes that eat plants. So in this case, it would mostly be marine algae. So it actually turns out that there's multiple types of marine algae. There are the tall kind of branching algae bits, and then there are these little microalgae and everything kind of in between. And when you're looking at a coral reef ecosystem, for coral reefs, their biggest competitor is actually algae. Plants are way better at incorporating sunlight. They grow faster than corals, and without the help of fishes to graze back the algae could easily very much overrun a coral reef. But it turns out that these different algae have different strategies. But these coral reef fishes, have evolved to specialize on different types of algae. So only when you have all of these different fishes in the ecosystem can you actually kind of keep that algae under control. If you exclude one type of fish, then the algae that they specialize in kind of grows out of control. So all of these guys are kind of participating in this really delicate kind of balance to keep algae in check on the reef.
I imagine we see similar things with insects, Scott.
Absolutely. In some of the systems we study, you can think about it like your basic food chain that we learned about in elementary school. You have your plants, you have your herbivores, and then you have your predators. And when you move or perturb any one of those levels of the system, you can have imbalance occur. So we have a really fun study we did right here in Houston looking at the live oaks that cover the Rice University campus where we are currently. And we look at the herbivores that live on those live oaks, and then we think about the predators. In some areas of our urban environment, other folks that maintain these properties have put giant nets over the oaks to stop roosting birds. So we have a lot of coastal roosting birds that can cause some damage, and they can number in the thousands or tens of thousands. So they can be kind of an urban pest. And so to get rid of those, folks have put over nets. What that did was it also removed all birds from those oak trees. And we happen to be studying a very interesting herbivorous insect called the asp caterpillar. It is one of the most venomous caterpillars in North America. They're common on Rice's campus, but they're in balance here because the birds that eat them keep them at low levels, which we call biocontrol. However, in other areas of Houston where these nets have been put up and insectivorous birds have been removed, we've had a massive increase in this asp caterpillar, upwards of 7,000% of what we see in a more natural environment. So just removing a predator can have an immediate effect on the course of years.
And these asp caterpillars, these are those kind of like fuzzy caterpillars we see around town that people are kind of afraid of from childhood because you pick it up once and realize like this was not a good idea.
Yeah, they're a very interesting looking critter. They can vary in their color. They tend to be tan in color and have this giant tuft of hair. Don't pet them because underneath that hair are these little spines that that deliver the venom. And so it's very common for you to accidentally run into it and grab it or sit on them. And if it gets on your skin, it can hurt really bad. It's been compared to blunt force trauma or a broken bone if you really get envenomated pretty strongly. So again, this is a natural outcome of disturbing biodiversity, which serves in this purpose as a biocontrol of something that's quite dangerous.
Well, and I feel like for the last couple of years, I've managed to see an article each year in the Chronicle about more and more of these caterpillars are around. What's going on with that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a normal part of our environment. They have been here for millennia, but when things get out of balance, things can go awry.
And it's kind of cool because I've actually only seen like one asp in Houston my entire life. And it's because I spent so much time on campus where they're in balance. I almost never see them. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, it's not something that we have around here. That's an excellent point. So I'm curious, you just hosted this whole symposium around biodiversity. And so clearly, thinking about balance, thinking about these different ways that systems support each other and the important roles that things play. But I'm curious what came from that day of symposia, from that, series of conversations. What are some of the other trends that were being identified, and why is it important to be having these conversations around biodiversity?
Well, yeah, it was. So the Biodiversity Symposium was this really excellent event that brought in a lot of kind of thinkers and leaders in the biodiversity field in the state of Texas. So we had a lot of folks come in. They were sharing their ideas, they were sharing thoughts, concepts, and we even had participants from the kind of general community. And it was a really great kind of venue to kind of synthesize ideas and come up with new ones. Throughout kind of free discussion and collaboration and things like that. And it's super important. It was important primarily, one, because Houston is a immensely biodiverse place. It's sitting kind of at the precipice and at kind of ground zero for climate change. So as, sea levels rise and as temperatures increase, Houston is going to see a lot of changes. That being said, Houston is an incredibly biodiverse place, so this was a great place to have it and an important place to have it and kind of facilitate those discussions.
Can you say more about Houston's biodiversity specifically? Because I think that's something we've talked about on the show with different folks over the years. But I think that's something that, folks still kind of struggle with. There's a lot of Houston concrete everywhere, right? Big, tall buildings, not probably the first place we think of when we imagine rich, vibrant environments. And yet there is an incredible amount of biodiversity here. There are, the incredible park systems, there's the bayous, there's all these different kinds of ecotypes going on with different regions that were of the city. So can you share a little bit about what makes Houston so biodiverse?
Yeah, so Houston has many different ecosystems, and the biodiversity in Houston is actually one of my favorite things about the city. Buffalo Bayou, for example, if you just take Buffalo Bayou, is packed to the brim with wildlife. We have a bat colony with like 500,000 bats that live under one bridge. People catch like 7-foot alligator gar out of that river every year. I've found snakes and coyotes and all kinds of like insane wildlife just in that park alone. And even outside of the park in the neighborhoods, especially in places like kind of the Heights and Rice Military, you can hear narrow-mouthed toads, during the summertime and things like that. So it's a very, 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 very biodiverse place.
And if I could just add on to that,
Yeah,
taking a step back in the geography of where we are, Houston just so happens to be at this intersection of many different ecotypes. So if you drive north, you're in the piney woods. If you drive west, you're in the Katy Prairie and you get to post oak savannas. If you drive southwest, well, you run into an ocean. So you have the coastal prairie and you have marine and coastal environments there. So that intersection of all those habitats just means you just have many more things adapted to each one, all really close. And then even a further step back, Houston is in the subtropics. So we tend to be located in the southern edge of the ranges of many plants and animals that live farther north. And we tend to also be at the northern edge of many things that live farther south. So between all of those intersecting right here, we have a lot of different organisms that you can see within a 10-minute or even an hour drive of downtown Houston.
Yeah, it's really, it's remarkable when you kind of look at a map of different ecotypes of the area and you kind of sit there going like, right, this is just Harris County.
Yeah,
There's like 7 different things going on.
Right.
And to start to get this real sense of just how many different kinds of plants and animals have adapted and move throughout these spaces is really fascinating. You were saying, though, that Houston's climate is changing, right? You're talking about the different ways that, we can think certainly of rising waters, by the coast. We can think of the fact that it's getting hotter here. But what are some of the ways that the climate is changing, that you're seeing climate change impact this array of biodiversity, but also maybe specific species?
Right. I can jump in on one real quick,
that.
Korey. Yeah. So one thing we're seeing right here on the Texas coast is that winters sometimes can be a little warmer, and that is causing the mangroves, which live in our southern coastline, so down in places like Corpus and Brownsville, those mangroves have been moving up the coastline systematically, and that is a change from the grassland ecosystems in the marine and coastal environments that are more native to the northern coast of Texas. So in the last 20, 30 years, scientists have been mapping the movement of mangroves slowly and slowly. So I grew up in this area. I grew up fishing in Galveston Bay. I very rarely saw mangroves. But now, 40 years later, we see giant outcrops of mangroves growing all over the coastline here in the northern Texas coast. And that is a reflection of the fact that it's just a little warmer in the wintertime. And so that hard freeze that used to push back the mangroves and keep them farther south has been removed. And so they're starting to move up the coast. And we see this exact same pattern over in Florida. Mangroves are moving northward. And that changes all kinds of interactions in communities. And since Korey's a marine biologist, he could probably tell us what.
Yeah, so what you're describing is we call it tropicalization, where species at lower latitudes are able to move further north because the climate has become kind of more favorable for them. And what this has done kind of in fishes and things like that is it's introduced a bunch of new interactions and competition. Oftentimes, species that live at temperate latitudes kind of enjoy this kind of like reduction in competition, especially for fish. They enjoy this kind of increase in resources, so there's lots of things to eat and less competition because their warm water competitors can't really kind of stick it out all year round. But as things warm up, you get more and more competition. So along the Texas coast, snook is a great example. So snook is this really kind of famous game fish that's really a tropical fish. They're big-time predators. They get pretty big. People like to catch them. But for the longest time, snook really needed to stay in these warmer environments. But as kind of the entire planet is warming, snook have been kind of working their way up the Texas coast. So we can get snook at certain times of year a little further south in Texas. So,
what else does that impact, though, if the snook are moving up? Because you've said, they're quite large and they eat things. So how does that impact other fish?
So it puts more pressure on the prey that the snook are going to be eating, because snook are eating small fish like pinfish and some of the smaller kind of herring and shad and things like that. And those shad were already being fed on by other things too. So it basically results in kind of less food to go around for everybody else. And that's really kind of the issue with these temperate species, is that they kind of get pinched in the middle. So temperate species, they like it not too cold, not too hot. So they have a really narrow band. And what happens when these warm species move up is the temperate species may not necessarily be able to move up, maybe due to lack of habitat or lack of resources. So they really get pinched kind of between a rock and a hard place.
And another interesting thing about the changing in climate is that it's also impacting the frequency of extreme weather events. And so we live here on the Gulf Coast, so hurricanes have been part of life here for millennia, but we are observing changes in potentially the magnitude of hurricanes because the surface of the ocean is a little warmer. We're also seeing more extreme cold snaps at these middle latitudes. We're seeing increases in drought in our region that are either increasing in frequency or magnitude as the planet's been warming as well. So one of the cool things that biodiversity scientists are thinking about right now is, yes, there are these systematic changes, but there are also these huge, very specific extreme weather events that may also be perturbing biodiversity and changing things that might have really long-term impacts.
Can you say more about that? Because I'm curious, and maybe going back to the example of mangroves, which is interesting because I think so many scientist friends of mine, when we talk about mangroves, especially on the Gulf Coast, it's very, this is, a buffer defense. This is a critical defense for the Gulf. But it's not actually Houston's defense, as you were pointing out, right? Like we're not familiar with giant mangrove fields here. If those are moving up, I'm curious both about, is that potentially an advantage? Is that a kind of, natural buffer we're developing? Is that even perhaps better than the traditional coastal prairie that's been here from a kind of hurricane perspective maybe? But then the caveat to that is, if you're pointing to these cold snaps that'll kill off mangroves, how permanent is that defense? Is this something we can imagine as a static change?
Yep.
And so I'm curious about how that's reshaping our ecology.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It illustrates the complexity of any of the things we're talking about and thinking about. It is true. Mangroves do protect the shoreline, and so they are viewed as a positive in certain situations. That has to be taken in the context of it also changes all the other things along the coastline that may be important and we may value, like game fish, which draw in tens of millions of dollars a year to the Texas economy for people wanting to fish certain types of fishes that may or may not live in mangroves versus, other open environments with more coastal grasses and things like that. So, it's an interesting thing to think about. I don't know that answer, actually. I think that's one thing that scientists are thinking about. Clearly, the mangroves are one we've been able to watch over decades moving, and this increased frequency of these cold snaps, I'm unclear of how impactful they are specifically to mangroves versus just the average change of winters here in the Texas coast. So those are two different kind of forces that can perturb the environment, and I don't think we know which one is more or less important for species X or ecosystem Y.
And while mangroves moving north might be a good thing for kind of coastline stability, there are a bunch of other things moving north that are not so good, like zoonotic diseases that were typically kind of confined to the tropics. Now those kind of
Can
mosquitoes.
you clarify what that is?
Zoonotic diseases are kind of animal-borne diseases. So mosquitoes in the tropics typically carry tons of different diseases, malaria, yellow fever, things like that. Because that climate is becoming more favorable for them outside of that tropical range, these animals can now move forward as well, or move north as well. Things like vampire bats are also moving north as well. And vampire bats are cool, but if you're not pro vampire bat, then tropicalization is going to be a problem for you because they're coming.
Outside of just the fact that it has a scary name, and I think people get a little freaked out about the idea of vampires moving in near them, are there other considerations we should be thinking about with vampire bats? I mean, we did just go through a pandemic that a lot of folks are looking pretty clearly at bats as a culprit of.
Yeah, so that's also an issue, and you have this animal that basically like feeds on blood, so it's like it's traveling around and like creating open wounds, which is like not ideal, right? And it's feeding from host to host to host, so it could become an issue for livestock, which is their preferred prey. They like to basically follow around and like bite cow ankles and stuff like that. So as these animals come into contact with herds, further north, there is that opportunity to spread disease in that way.
And kissing bugs are also moving northward right now into the state of Texas, specifically from more tropical areas, and they carry Chagas disease.
Oh.
And we know very little about that interaction, and there's labs up at Texas A&M studying this right now. So thinking about, hey, they're increasing in frequency in our area. They are carrying this disease in higher frequency. What are the potential impacts? So, there's all sorts of things moving north that we might want to be concerned about.
Well, I think this is a really good point, too, because oftentimes when I talk to folks in the space, when we think of biodiversity, the kind of first places folks tend to go are, biodiversity is shrinking, and that's bad, and we've been killing off insects, and we're losing butterflies, right? And we can look at a number of different causes from that, not least of which is just spraying insecticides. And I think a lot of folks in conservation spaces tend to immediately jump to the retraction of biodiversity being the troubling issue. And a lot of what you're suggesting here is actually an expanding biodiversity is also a real concern when we're introducing unfamiliar things to an area to see how those can interrelate, especially as you were pointing with somewhere like Houston, where we do have a tremendous amount of biodiversity. I could see how introducing new things like vampire bats that's moving between those might be uniquely well-positioned to cause disturbances. So I'm curious about, when we're thinking of these issues, and thank you for both expanding that frame, what are some of those other concerns? Are we also needing to be worried about a contraction of biodiversity and not just new species moving in?
Yeah, so I would say it's really important to be concerned about the contraction of biodiversity, and the new species coming in, it's not like a kind of a simple addition game, right? The new species that come in might even outcompete the species that were there before, so they could even propagate more and more biodiversity contraction. So that's a big issue. And with the new species coming in, you mentioned that it's unfamiliar, and it's important that it's unfamiliar because basically our systems are not built to deal with mosquitoes that are transferring yellow fever, that are carrying yellow fever and malaria and things like that. And it takes a little while for our systems to adjust. Back when our systems had the flexibility and the movement. Right now, our our health systems and our disease tracking systems are severely hampered. So introducing and throwing in a bunch of animals, a bunch of new diseases from the tropics right now could be pretty bad.
Yeah, and both are probably true, right? We are losing biodiversity at a staggering rate, And movement across the planet is also happening, both due to climate change and also due to human-mediated movement. We are moving things across the planet at an alarming rate. So, you can have movement and new species coming in, all the effects Korey just talked about. At the same time, we're also at a biodiversity crisis where we are losing the benefits. Sometimes these are quantified in ways like ecosystem services. Like, what does biodiversity do? Well, a major important point is they pollinate 80% of the plants we eat. That's going to be a problem if biodiversity is decreasing. Just like my example before of the asked caterpillars, a lot of biodiversity serves as a biocontrol for the rest of the system. If we remove one member of that system, we can have it either fall apart or get out of balance as well. So those are important aspects of that biodiversity loss that I think are really quantifiable.
So something occurs to me here, which I think some folks might interject as a critique. I think it in reality is just kind of a condition of life, but climates do change over time. I think it is irresponsible to not immediately caveat that with humans have contributed to that and sped it up at a level that's pretty historically non-comparable to the rate at which normal environmental change occurs. And exactly as you're pointing to, some of that is climate change that we're driving, but some of it, we can go back 300 years and look at plenty of examples of ships, from the 1700s carrying new species unintentionally to islands throughout the world, right? And of course, as you're pointing to, as human freight shipping in particular has ramped up to incredibly high levels, we see different species attaching themselves, linking themselves onto ships and moving throughout the world and spreading in new ways. And so I think that's, an important caveat. The flip side is places do change over time. So presumably nature has some remedies for understanding, okay, a new species has introduced itself, and then over time a place will adapt to that in some way. So how do we need to speed up that evolution? Do we need to combat that evolution? And I think probably it's a case-by-case answer, but I'm wondering what are strategies we can draw on for these places that are finding themselves in the crux of change, that are experiencing this influx of new species, this reduction of kind of classic species. As we go through these moments of change, what are some ways we can address that? What are some ways we can help ourselves and our environments and ecologies around us to navigate those shifts?
So yeah, great. That's a great point. So what I will say is that nature does basically always adjust, throughout the history of nature, mass extinction after mass extinction, and with shifting climates, nature has always responded and rebounded. But nature kind of can take a while, right? Nature takes millions and millions of years. Humans have been around for like 800,000 years.
Blink of an eye compared
tops,
to
right? And so, in the span of time it would take for nature to adjust, even 1 million years is like pretty fast. It's a pretty quick rate of evolution for something, right? So
you're not going to live to be a million. I was really aiming for that personally. So.
Yeah, and like we haven't even been around for a million years, and the human footprint around the world has been undeniable. So it's really kind of puts it into perspective the speed at which we've changed the climate. And the truth of the matter is, many of these organisms will not be able to adapt in time. Others will, many will, but we're also going to lose quite a bit. And when you lose those species, it takes a lot of time for other species to evolve these novel traits to kind of refill those niches. All the while, humans presumably are going to be here, for at least a little while longer, and we're going to be the ones that actually suffer the impacts because nature's going to be fine. Nature has millions of years. It has all the time in the world until like the sun destroys the solar system. We don't have that. We don't have that time. There are things that we can do to kind of slow the rate and slow the pace of climate change. There are things that we can do from an infrastructure level to prepare for shifting climates and shifting distributions and species. We can build climate smart infrastructure. We can, work harder to kind of control pests and control invasive species and things like that. And the cool thing is that ecosystems actually do respond and recover pretty quickly. So even if it takes species a long time to evolve novel traits, if you leave ecosystems alone, if you kind of reduce the human pressure on them for even like a decade, a couple, maybe 5-6 years, these ecosystems oftentimes rebound. Some ecosystems rebound more quickly than others. Things like grasslands, for instance, take a really long time to come back, if they do ever come back at all, but other ecosystems do bounce back, especially marine ecosystems. So there is a lot of hope in that rebound, but you have to give these ecosystems time and space to kind of bounce back.
Yeah, just building off of that, we were talking about, causes of biodiversity loss and then potential solutions. So we've talked about climate change, we talked about invasive species. Another really core cause of biodiversity loss is just simply habitat change and habitat destruction. And so, Korey's mentioning about like giving nature a break. Like one of the things we could really do to mediate this process is just to conserve more land in a more natural environment rather than this constant pressure to change it into a cornfield, which is good, right? Feeds people, but we need to do those things in a more sustainable way that we think more in the long term of preserving biodiversity. So if I'm thinking about like what is the biggest thing affecting, biodiversity loss, it's just simply habitat change, habitat destruction. That is an enormous pressure on biodiversity that's removing natural areas at an alarming rate, and thus the extinction process is also increasing at that same rate. So then solutions is preserving these places, and scientists and conservationists really one of the benefits of this symposium was it had folks like Korey and I that live in an academic space and folks that are on the ground living that conservation, that work in the conservation fields, come together and talk in the symposium. Like, what are we all thinking about? What are we all doing? How could we come together and collaborate when we maybe don't collaborate as much as we should? I think that was actually one of the most important things, was just conversations of folks worried about biodiversity at local and global scales that live within 50 miles of Houston, that don't talk as much. And so one of the benefits was getting together and talking about how we can conserve. So we had a wonderful speaker from the Nature Conservancy talking about how they're conserving land and purchasing land and also just working with landowners to keep their land natural. And maybe having sustainable ranching on that property at the same time sustaining that and doing it in a sustainable way to keep the natural environment more balanced. So again, back to the core of what I was saying is just, habitat change, habitat destruction is a really key factor to this biodiversity crisis we're in now.
What does that mean? I'm curious about sustainable ranching. Like, because I'm also curious about what you're getting at, which is, I think when we imagine conservation, we tend to really focus in on, okay, we're going to buy a national park, right? We're going to suddenly declare an area a big protected zone. And that's what folks tend to think of when they imagine conservation. They aren't thinking of the thousands of acres around Galveston that have been conserved by different groups working in that area, and essentially letting it just return to nature and essentially letting it kind of go wild, which is a different approach. And it's a very different approach to that kind of landowner engaged and some of the practices we might imagine to, not totally convert a cornfield, to use your example, into nature again, but to make some of the practices being utilized on that cornfield less directly harmful to everything around it and actually on the ground itself. And so what are some of the practices we could imagine implementing or utilizing maybe in the ranching context, maybe in an urban context, that we could think would be beneficial for good biodiversity?
Yeah, so this is not my area of expertise, but I've indirectly run into folks thinking about this, and so it's I'm so happy that this is an active area of research. You should probably have a sustainable rancher come in and speak about this directly, but it has to do with decreasing that pressure, right? So the number of individual cattle you have on any one property, and then second is moving them around to different parts of the property. So decreasing that pressure, changing the on and off of that pressure. Because if you think about what this area, and certainly areas of the central United States look like 1,000 years ago, they had giant herds of bison moving. And so every organism that lived in that area was adapted to this disturbance. And so you can actually see sustainable ranching practices that can emulate that and actually can increase the biodiversity of grasses in an area that's managed versus unmanaged, where you just let it go. The one that is managed properly actually has more biodiversity than the one that doesn't. The one that's managed properly actually stores carbon better and longer in the root system and in the soil than the one that is just let to grow and become natural again. So those are really important things that I've seen in that area.
Yeah, and to totally kind of add on with what Scott was talking about, there are ways to kind of manage things in urban settings as well, where maybe you don't have a huge plot of land to manage, but you can like not litter, and you can make these kind of simple choices. There's also kind of the issues with chemical runoff for agriculture and things like that. So choosing pesticides that might not be as toxic to the environment. Can also help biodiversity. So it helps to kind of make those, sometimes even the little small choices can have pretty big impacts.
Yeah, and one thing that's happening on campus is our new director of the Arboretum on campus, Cassidy Johnson, has been really involved with these urban prairies, very small pocket prairies across our city, where you allow something to become naturalized again and you replant it in a systematic way using native species, and you see an immediate impact on the biodiversity you can see in just the middle of downtown Houston. You go from 10 pollinators to 30 or 40 pollinators present very, very quickly, and you see these kind of like, it's almost like a snowball effect of, if you build it, they will come.
I was just about to say that.
Sorry, I stole your
Dang
movie
it.
quote. And so Cassidy's been really involved with that here on campus, having the conservation biology program in the biosciences department. Student groups have been working on this. They've been building pocket prairies over at the medical center, which is right across the street. So there's one over there. And then there's some more natural prairies in our area that are also being preserved. So on the opposite end of that, they're urban but haven't quite been bulldozed yet. And so we're preserving those. There's something called the Deer Park Prairie that has some amazing biodiversity towards our coast. And then the Katy Prairie to our west has been preserving all sorts of diversity there. And in fact, a fun story, I happened to be studying a group of insects that lived on the coast and lived on saline salt flats. And we learned that they were actually a little more inland on some other saline habitats that were pushed inland. So one to our northeast, is called Sour Lake. We found that beetle there when we didn't expect it to be there. And I said, where else would I see these saline flats? And I knew that there was an endangered plant on the Katy Prairie that had a saline salt association. Went there, worked with their landowners. I literally got out of the car, and one of these new beetles ran onto my boot. And so we captured it there in the Katy Prairie. We captured it in a couple other places. We did some DNA. We did some other work to understand what this was. And it was actually an entirely new undescribed species that was living amongst us, hiding out on the Katy Prairie for millennia, that was preserved because that Katy Prairie had been preserved, even though there's tons of pressure and development going on in West Houston right now.
Well, and I'm curious because something you mentioned earlier is that grassland takes longer to kind of naturally replenish, and so I'm wondering if you can say anything just about that, because we are here on what was predominantly a coastal prairie ecoregion that ran down the Texas coast, which folks love to say there's less than 1% that remains from that original prairie, and so I'm curious about why grassland in particular takes longer to kind of come back and see that same level of rich growth in that ecotype.
So this is not my area of expertise at all, and I actually learned this during the Biodiversity Symposium, which was
See
really
the
cool.
point of the
Yeah, because I
getting
was
together
just
and learning.
originally I thought if you create the space, plant the seeds, the grass comes back. But the truth of the matter is the grass really needs very specific kind of chemical conditions. It takes a long time for these native grasses to grow because they put down pretty deep roots. So they put down these deep roots so that you have to have good conditions for a while before they start the kind of above ground growth. So you need proper conditions and a lot of time for these guys to bounce back.
Well, and those roots that you mentioned is also one of the big advantages folks love to point out is, they're better at soaking up water, they're better at holding together land. So a lot of the very real things we worry about around subsidence and around, flooding in a place like Houston, these native grasses do a really remarkable job of addressing. We're rapidly coming to the end of our time, but I'd love to hear how folks can learn more about biodiversity if they're interested, or if there are ways that they can get engaged. Certainly it sounds like just planting some things, and you've listed a great bunch of organizations they might want to partner with or learn more about. But are there other groups you'd like to shout out, or if there are ways in Houston in particular you can imagine folks really wanting to get their hands dirty and do some good work to help all of our various biodiverse friends, what they might go about doing?
Some organizations that would be good to plug into to get some more information include kind of the Nature Conservancy, the Rice Sustainability Institute actually connects a lot of the faculty here at Rice University who are actively engaged in biodiversity research, and there are a ton of different online resources as well to kind of help you learn more about the biodiversity of Houston and even more broadly, and connect with other kind of actors and scientists in that space.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, some other institutes or entities that were part of the Biodiversity Symposium, we had folks from the Houston Museum of Natural Science, the Houston Zoo, our Houston Arboretum gave a wonderful conservation talk about what it's like to like kind of rehabilitate a habitat right here in downtown Houston.
We had them on just a few weeks ago. Folks can go back and listen to that whole conversation and learn about the work they're doing.
Yeah, so wonderful work there. And then, you mentioned this at the very beginning. We do have a wonderful park system here in Houston, and that includes Herman Park and Memorial Park, which are giant green spaces, pretty big for the fourth largest city in the United States. I'll also give a shout out to our Harris County Park system because I worked there as a teenager. So we have many wonderful smaller parks that are just all littered around the city. One of my favorite, where I worked when I was a teenager, was the Jesse Jones Park up north. Has a wonderful nature center, has a wonderful system of trails that goes down to Spring Creek, which dumps into the San Jacinto River, and is connected by a greenbelt system there. So it's just a wonderful place, and it's just, within a stone's throw of downtown Houston. So great places, great people.
Well, Dr. Scott Egan, Dr. Korey Evans, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Enjoyed it.
Now we're going to go to a piece from our researcher, Sophia, all about different places to explore to see some of that biodiversity here in Houston.
This is Sophia, and welcome to Urban Explorer, finding wild places in city spaces. In this new series, we will traverse some of the natural areas tucked away near, or even in, Houston's familiar urban landscapes. To kick off the series, we will be leaving the concrete jungle and visiting Brazos Bend State Park. Think about Houston for a second and note what comes to mind. I'm willing to bet that most of you are thinking about its skyscrapers, 10-lane highways, and the constant buzz of life and activity that characterize the city. Now, imagine stepping away from all of this. Instead of honking cars, you hear birds. Instead of concrete sidewalks, you walk on swooping trails. Instead of city lights, you can see the open sky framed by swaying tree branches. Brazos Bend State Park is just an hour from downtown Houston, but it feels like a different world. Today, we're exploring what makes this park a place where city dwellers can reconnect with nature. I got the chance to attend a research field trip with a group of students from Rice University and learn about just how valuable Brazos Bend State Park is to surrounding communities. We'll hear from the park superintendent, the group of students conducting the research in the area, and finally, their professor, Dr. Scott Solomon, who has been bringing students to Brazos Bend for over 15 years. Let's start with one of the people responsible for making sure visitors have an experience worth returning for, the park's superintendent, Jason Castle. When you live in Houston, it's easy to forget that natural spaces like Brazos Bend State Park are nearby. As the students arrived, Castle explained his role in making this space accessible and welcoming for guests of the park.
And I'm not a biologist. My degree is in psychology, so more I'm the people person. My degree has more of hospitality aspect because we're nothing without our park visitors. So if I didn't know how to understand folks that visit us, understand that they come from cities, they probably don't see this stuff very often, and that's kind of what we are as educators. Ultimately, that's the bigger picture of what we do.
We often think of parks as just being there, but places like Brazos Bend State Park require care from a full staff and volunteers, as well as a vision. In addition to being a beautiful place to come and relax, Brazos Bend State Park has a mission to educate its visitors. During my visit, I got to speak with one of the students, Sonakshi Bala, about the research that they were conducting and what they had to learn from the area.
Can you tell me a bit about what y'all are doing here today?
Yeah, so we're doing a lab for Bios 213, and we're here in Brazos Bend to collect some soil samples and test out some different environmental metrics and the various ecosystems around the park. So, yeah.
It's one thing to read about prairies, forests, and wetlands in a textbook. It's another to stand in the middle of it, to take samples, observe wildlife, and feel the impact of what you're studying. Brazos Bend State Park provides invaluable opportunities for students, as well as those who just want to learn and enjoy nature, to leave the city and truly connect. I asked Maya Harpovit, a fellow student and Houston native, what her favorite part of Brazos Bend was, as well as some things that she may have been surprised about.
So, what's your favorite part of Brazos Bend?
I came here when I was a kid with my parents, and we got to see a lot of alligators. We actually camped here once, so it's really nice to come back and be able to see everything from a lab perspective and collect data to use for analysis as well.
Are you surprised that this extremely biodiverse natural area is less than an hour outside of Houston?
I think definitely. I think I knew about it because I am from Houston, but still, that being said, we've seen so many different parts and learned more about them, and it's really cool that this is so close to Rice and where we live, and I feel like more people should come check it out.
This reaction of surprise isn't uncommon. Throughout the day, we found ourselves stopping in our tracks multiple times, pointing excitedly to an alligator basking in the sun, a bright red cardinal hopping from branch to branch, or some deer peering cautiously at us from afar. So many people are shocked when they realize they don't have to go far to experience the wild, but visiting Brazos Bend State Park was a good reminder that for Houstonians, nature is always just around the corner. So, why does this contrast matter? What does it mean for people in Houston to have Brazos Bend State Park so close by? To help answer these questions and more, I spoke with Dr. Scott Solomon, a biologist, ecology and evolutionary biology professor at Rice University, and host of the Wild World podcast. Dr. Solomon has been taking students on this research trip to Brazos Bend for over 15 years, and is here today to discuss the importance of Brazos Bend State Park for city dwellers. Welcome to the show, Dr. Solomon.
Thank you so much.
So, first off, can you tell me what you were doing at Brazos Bend and a little bit about how long you've been coming out to the area with students from Rice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I teach a class in the biosciences department called Introduction. I guess it's called Introductory Lab in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, BIOS 213. And every semester we take a field trip over to Brazos Bend State Park. And we do that for a few reasons. One is that we're trying to teach the students about the field of ecosystem ecology. And that's really a field in biology in which we try to understand ecosystems, in their entirety. So not just about the living things, but also about the physical environment, right? The soil, the rocks, the temperature, everything, the water, right? And right in our backyard, we have this amazing place, Brazos Bend State Park, where you can see different ecosystems like the coastal prairie, like a bottomland forest, like a wetland, and they're all right next to one another. So it's really great for the students to get to experience what these ecosystems are like and to practice the skills that we use as biologists to actually go into those places and to try to look at them a bit more carefully, to try to actually be able to quantify some of the differences between the environments. So we have them doing things like measuring the pH of the soil, like looking at the moisture of the soil, the air temperature, soil temperature, and we're trying to look for what are the physical differences between a forest and a prairie that might help us understand why you get these different ecosystems right next to one another.
And Rice, along with the majority of Houstonians, is located in a very urban area of Houston. So, in a busy urban environment like Houston, how do you think that Brazos Bend can serve as a place where city dwellers can connect with nature?
Yeah, I think Brazos Bend State Park is one of the best places in our area for getting to actually experience some nature. So, Houston, before it became the city of Houston, was a coastal prairie, and the coastal prairie ecosystem is actually one of the most endangered, if not the most endangered ecosystem in all of North America. Less than 1% of it actually remains intact. And over at Brazos Bend, you can actually
go in and walk around in a remnant of that coastal prairie. So for people that want to see, what was this area like before the city of Houston was built, that's one of the best places. And they have incredible wildlife. And I think that's probably the thing that it's best known for. Alligators are the biggest draw for a lot of people. It's a great place to come and see alligators in the wild safely, sometimes up pretty close, and we got pretty close to some when we were just there. But the bird life is phenomenal. You can see all different sorts of birds and other animals too. We saw deer, we saw some turtles, we saw some lizards. There's all different sorts of things. You never quite know what you're going to see, but it is a great, convenient, nearby place where you can go and see what this area used to look like in the past, and to see some pretty cool wildlife as well.
Yeah, that's perfect. I was actually just gonna take the conversation in that direction, but adding on to that, how does the park support such a diverse ecosystem?
Yeah, well, we actually got to see some of that in action because, or I guess the aftermath of it, because they have just recently done a prescribed burn. And so fire is actually one of the natural ways that prairies remain prairies, because what happens is the plant species that tend to grow in prairies, especially the grasses, are adapted to be able to tolerate fire without it killing them. And so the grass that we see above ground can burn, but most of their tissue is actually in their root structure that's underground, and it can regrow from that. Whereas a lot of the woody plants, things like trees, big old oak trees that we all love, but they don't really belong in a prairie. They are not going to be able to survive a fire. And so they just about a month ago, but a month before we went there, the superintendent of the park, Jason Castle, actually met with us and talked about how they did this prescribed burn, which is done very carefully, only under the right conditions to make sure it's done safely. But they do that to make sure that any woody vegetation that's starting to grow in the prairie where it doesn't belong is going to get knocked back, and that's going to give those prairie plant species a chance to grow. So having a mixture of different ecosystems, having prairie, having forest where it is allowed to grow, where they don't do these burns, and then also having wetlands. All three of those together is going to support a very rich and a very diverse ecosystem. And so having a lot of different species of wildlife there, part of the reason for it is because you have these different ecosystems, different habitats right next to one another.
In addition to conservation and recreation, how does the park participate in educating people who come to visit?
Yeah, well, we saw some of that too, because, like I said, we got to meet with the park superintendent. He mentioned that this is a part of what he does, what he loves doing, and they have volunteers as well that will go around and interact with folks and answer people's questions, point things out that they might not have seen or might not know about. They also have a nice visitor center where you can go in and you can see some displays, some educational displays. They often have like some baby alligators that they are making sure are safe, and then they'll release them back out to the wild, but you can see those, and that's really fun. There's also the observatory there that's run by the Houston Museum of Natural Science, which is right there in Brazos Bend State Park, and that's another major educational resource. So they're doing all different sorts of things. Their website's really useful in terms of getting information about like what species of plants and animals live there. So yeah, it's a really great resource.
And in addition to that resource, do you have any advice for those from the city who are interested in visiting Brazos Bend State Park, whether in the places that they can go or the people that they should talk to?
Yeah, I mean, so when you go to the park, you can get a free map, and the maps are really useful for seeing where some good trails are. They have campsites there. It's another great way that people can experience the park. But these days there's also all of these amazing apps that can be useful for helping to identify the things that you see. So I really like iNaturalist, which, if you're not familiar, is an app you can get on your phone, and basically you take a picture of something and you're like, I don't know what this is. It's a flower, and it will recognize the species based on the photo, or at least give you some suggestions for what it thinks it is. And it can use your location to kind of narrow down the pool of what it might be. There's a related app called Seek, which is part of the same database, so that can be a useful one just to give you identification suggestions. There's a few that are also other apps that are specific to particular groups of organisms, like eBird is really good for bird sightings. And then there's some plant-specific apps. But I really like iNaturalist as just a general resource. I use it myself when I see something I'm like, ooh, I don't recognize that. What might that be? And then once you have a name, then you can start to being able to unlock the vast, databases that we have, the vast amount of information that exists for any particular plant, animal, fungus, whatever it is that you see. And I really recommend practicing that, because once you learn a little bit about something that you see out there, it just makes it that much more interesting and special.
Yeah, well, Dr. Solomon, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your expertise with our listeners. I'm sure it will be extremely valuable.
Thanks so much, Sophia.
And to everyone listening, make sure to go out and visit Brazos Bend State Park. I just got the chance to go up for the second time with Dr. Solomon and his class, and it was amazing as always. This unfortunately concludes our first segment of Urban Explorer, but thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll be back soon.
Finally, we'll go to Jaden, who'll tell you how you can get involved in Houston this week.
Hey y'all, looking for something to do in Houston this week? Consider spending time outdoors and volunteering. On Tuesday, April 22nd, Habitat Days are happening at University of Houston Clear Lake. Join UHCL from 9 to 11 a.m. for their Habitat Days event, where you'll be able to help with weeding, mulching flower beds, planting native plants, maintaining pathways, trimming trees and bushes, and more. No prior experience is needed, and guides will be there to help you every step of the way. Tools are provided, but feel free to bring your own if you have them. Whether you're hoping for a relaxing morning in nature or looking to fulfill community service hours, this is a great opportunity. To join, visit UHCL's Habitat Days page and scroll to the bottom for directions and sign-up information. Alternatively, on Friday, May 3rd, it's the Spring 2025 Native Plant Sale with Galveston Bay Foundation. From 7:30 to 10:30 a.m., volunteer at the Galveston Bay Foundation's Native Plant Sale. You'll assist with event operations and support their conservation mission. The foundation grows Texas native prairie plants for restoration efforts and public sales, with all proceeds going back into conservation work. Refreshments and snacks will be provided for volunteers. To sign up, visit volunteerhou.org, select May 3rd event, and follow the link to register. If you're not volunteering, swing by and check it out anyway. It's a great way to learn about native plants and support local conservation. So if you're looking for something fun, meaningful, and outdoorsy to do this week, keep these events in mind, and happy volunteering.
Thanks for listening. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder, you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, original music by Carter Dean, research support provided by Jaden Brayboyce, Sophia Soltez, and Emin Rensdorf. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.